Have you ever had that feeling? That tiny splinter in your mind sensation that the person you're talking to isn't the person you've known your whole life? That their smile doesn't quite reach their eyes anymore? That the cadence of their voice is just a single, almost imperceptible beat off from what it should be? Most people dismiss it. A trick of the light. A lapse in memory. But what if it isn't? What if that person was replaced? And what if the thing that replaced them knows that you know? That's where my story begins. Not with a bang or a scream in the dark, but with a quiet, creeping dread that settled over our home like a fine layer of dust. A dread that started the day my father came home from his business trip. He looked the same, mostly. The same tired lines around his eyes, the same salt and pepper hair. But when he hugged my mother, he held her just a little too stiffly. When he spoke to me, his gaze seemed to focus on a point just behind my head. Little things. Things you tell yourself you're imagining. The first week it was just a feeling. The second week things started to happen. I found his wedding ring, the one he never took off, sitting on the kitchen counter. When I gave it to him, he just stared at it for a moment, a flicker of confusion in his eyes before slipping it on his finger as if he'd forgotten which one it went on. Then came the coffee. My father drank his coffee black, always. Said milk was for calves and sugar was a crime. One morning, I came down to find him stirring 3 heaping spoonfuls of sugar into his mug, humming a tune I'd never heard before. I asked him about it, joking. "Since when did you develop a sweet tooth?" He just looked at me, his smile not a smile at all, and said, "People change, son. It's good to try new things." The humming stopped. The house grew quiet. Later that day, I was in his study looking for a book. Tucked away on a high shelf, I found his old travel journal. He'd kept it for 20 years, documenting every trip, every city. I flipped it open, expecting to read about his latest trip to Chicago. Instead, the pages were filled with strange geometric symbols, drawn with an unnervingly precise hand. Page after page of them, like some alien alphabet. My blood ran cold. This wasn't my father. I didn't know what it was, but the man sleeping down the hall, the man who looked like my dad, was an imposter. The real turning point, the moment the quiet dread became shrieking terror, was that night. I was woken by a sound from downstairs. A rhythmic, wet, tearing sound. I crept to the top of the stairs, my heart hammering against my ribs. The light from the kitchen cast a long, distorted shadow into the hallway. Peeking around the corner, I saw him. He was standing at the kitchen sink, his back to me. He had my mother's cat Patches on the counter, and he was dismantling it, methodically, peeling back the skin with the precision of a surgeon, his hands moving with an unnatural dexterity. He wasn't being violent, not in the way a human is. He was being clinical, curious. As I watched, frozen in horror, he turned his head, not his body, just his head, a full 180 degrees, and looked directly up at me. His eyes were wide, and in the dim light they seemed to glow faintly. And then he smiled that same wrong smile. A piece of poor Patches still held delicately between his fingers. He didn't say a word. He just held my gaze. In that moment, I understood. It wasn't just that he knew that I knew. He wanted me to know. He was showing me. A warning. I ran back to my room, slammed the door, and shoved a dresser in front of it. I stayed there until morning, listening to the silence of the house, a silence that was now heavier, more menacing than any noise could ever be. When the sun came up, I crept back downstairs. The kitchen was spotless. Not a drop of blood, not a trace of what had happened. Patch's food bowl was full. My mother was making breakfast, humming that same tune he had been. She asked me if I'd seen the cat. "He probably just slipped out last night," my father said, walking into the room dressed for work. He patted me on the shoulder, his touch feeling like ice, and his eyes held a terrifying secret, a shared joke between just the two of us. I never saw the cat again, and now every night I lie awake, listening for that sound, listening for footsteps that pause just a little too long outside my door, because I know it's not a matter of if he'll come for me, but when. And the worst part, the absolute worst part, is that every morning my mother looks at him with such love, and I have to smile and pretend that everything is normal. That the man who tucks her into bed at night is the same man she married. I have to live with the thing that wears my father's face. The summer I turned 16, my friends and I thought we were invincible. We spent our nights chasing cheap thrills in the backwoods of North Carolina. Our favorite spot was an abandoned quarry we called the Devil's Jaw. It was a place steeped in local ghost stories, tales of miners lost in collapses, of strange lights in the sky, of a creature that stalked the woods surrounding it. We, of course, laughed it all off. It was just a place to build a bonfire and feel like kings of a forgotten world. One night, fueled by lukewarm beer and teenage bravado, we decided to explore a section of the woods we'd never been in before, chasing a rumor of an old, forgotten moonshiner's shack. The air grew colder the deeper we went, the sounds of the cicadas fading into an unnerving silence. The trees here were different, twisted and gnarled, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. It was my friend Leo who saw it first. He stopped dead in his tracks, his flashlight beam trembling. "What is that?" he whispered. Up ahead, perched on a low-hanging branch, was something that looked like a massive owl, but it was all wrong. It was too big, for starters, easily the size of a grown man, and its feathers were a mottled, sickly gray, like old dishwater rags. But it was the head that made my stomach clench. It swiveled to look at us, and it wasn't an owl's head. It was vaguely humanoid, with a flat, pale face and two enormous black, liquid eyes that reflected our flashlight beams with a predatory gleam. It had no beak, just a thin, lipless slit that stretched too wide across its face. A low, guttural clicking sound emanated from its throat, a sound that seemed to vibrate in my bones. We were paralyzed, caught in the unblinking stare of those abyssal eyes. It felt like it was looking past our skin, past our bones, right into our souls, and it was weighing them. Judging us, then it unfurled its wings. The sound was like old leather tearing, and the sheer span of them blotted out the moonlight above. It dropped from the branch, not with a flutter, but with a heavy, silent plummet, landing on the forest floor with a soft thud that was somehow more terrifying than a crash would have been. It stood on two long, jointed legs that bent the wrong way, like a bird's, but ended in what looked disturbingly like human feet, complete with long, yellowed toenails. It took a step towards us, its head cocked at an impossible angle, the clicking sound growing louder, faster. That broke the spell. We screamed, a chorus of pure animal terror, and we ran. We didn't look back. We just crashed through the undergrowth, branches whipping at our faces, the sound of our own panicked breathing deafening. But we could still hear it. It wasn't running. It was pacing us, moving through the dense woods with an eerie silence. The only sound, that of its relentless, rhythmic clicking. It was toying with us. We burst out of the tree line and back into the clearing of the Devil's Jaw, scrambling over loose rocks, heading for the perceived safety of our cars. I risked a glance over my shoulder. It was standing at the edge of the woods, a tall, spindly silhouette against the dark trees. It wasn't chasing us anymore. It just stood there, watching. We piled into Leo's beat-up sedan, fumbling with the keys, the engine roaring to life. As we tore down the gravel road, kicking up a plume of dust, I looked in the rearview mirror. It was still there. And as we sped away, it slowly raised one of its long, spindly arms and waved, a gesture so unnervingly human, so utterly out of place, that it haunts me more than the chase itself. We never went back to the Devil's Jaw. We never spoke of what we saw, not really. How do you explain a thing like that? But sometimes on quiet nights, when the wind rustles the leaves just right, I think I can hear it, that low guttural click. And I know it remembers us, and it's waiting. My grandmother's house was a museum of a life lived. Every surface was covered in knickknacks, photographs, and dusty souvenirs from places she's never been. But after she passed, we discovered her real collection. Hidden in the attic in a large, sea-worn trunk were her journals, dozens of them filled with her elegant looping cursive. At first, they were what we expected, daily musings, recipes, complaints about the neighbors. But then, about halfway through a journal from 1978, the entries changed. They became frantic, scared. She started writing about the man who came to visit in her dreams. She called him the Tinkerer. He was tall and impossibly thin, she wrote, dressed in a tattered, old-fashioned suit. His face was always in shadow, but his hands were long and pale with fingers like spiders. He never spoke, but he would show her things. He would open his hands, and in his palms would be intricate clockwork devices. tiny metal birds that sang silent songs, gears that spun into infinity, miniature human hearts that beat with a sickeningly real rhythm. He offered them to her. Every night in her dreams, he would offer her these impossible creations, his shadowy head cocked in a silent question. She always refused. To accept a gift from him, she wrote, is to give him a piece of yourself in return. A gear for a memory, a spring for a hope. The entries grew more disturbed. She started experiencing sleep paralysis. She'd wake in the night, unable to move, and see him standing in the corner of her room, a silhouette of a man holding something that glinted in the moonlight. She could hear the faint, delicate ticking of his clockwork creations. Then came the entries about lost time. She would be knitting in her armchair and suddenly find herself in the kitchen, hours later, with no memory of how she got there. A cup of tea would be half drunk on the counter, a meal she didn't remember making half-eaten on the table. Small things in the house began to change. A photograph would be turned to face the wall. A music box that had been broken for years would suddenly play a tinny, discordant tune in the middle of the night. A clock on the mantelpiece began to run backward. She was convinced the tinkerer was no longer confined to her dreams. He was seeping into her world piece by piece. The final entry in the last journal was barely legible, the penmanship a frantic scrawl. "He offered me the world tonight," it read. A perfect clockwork world where nothing ever breaks, where no one ever leaves. All I have to do is let him fix what's broken in me. He is in the room with me now. I can hear him winding the key. I am so tired of being broken. After that, the pages were blank. We found the journal in the trunk, and at the very bottom, nestled amongst the other books, was a small, exquisitely crafted silver locket. It was cold to the touch. I opened it. Inside, there were no pictures. Just a pair of impossibly tiny, intricate gears spinning slowly, silently, and perfectly in time with each other. I closed the locket and put it in my pocket. That night, for the first time in my life, I dreamt of a tall, thin man in a tea-faced suit. He stood in a vast, empty room, and when he opened his long, pale hands, he offered me a beautiful clockwork bird. And I have to admit, I'm tempted. I am so tired of being broken. I used to work the night shift at a self-storage facility. It was as boring as it sounds. Mostly, I just sat in a small, fluorescent-lit office, watched grainy CCTV monitors, and read paperback novels. The facility was a sprawling labyrinth of identical corrugated metal hallways, eerily silent after midnight. The only sounds were the hum of the lights and the occasional distant rumble of a freight train. That is, until the noises started in Unit 316. It began subtly, a soft scraping sound like a chair being dragged across concrete. I'd rewind the camera footage for that hallway, but there was never anything there. I chalked it up to the building settling, or rats. Then came the tapping. 3 distinct taps on the inside of the roll-up door, always around 3 a.m. It was rhythmic, deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. That was harder to explain away. There was no one in the facility but me. The access logs were clean. Unit 316 was registered to a woman who had passed away 2 years prior. Her family had cleared out most of her things, but the account was paid up for another 5 years, so the unit just sat there, officially empty but still leased. One night, curiosity or maybe just sheer boredom got the better of me. I grabbed the master keys and the bolt cutters just in case and walked down the long, echoing hallway to Unit 316. The air grew cold as I approached, the kind of damp chill that seeps into your bones. The lock on the unit was rusted, but it opened with a groan. I hesitated, my hand on the cold metal handle of the door. Then I took a deep breath and heaved it open. The smell hit me first. Dust, decay, and a faint cloying sweetness like rotting flowers. The unit was not empty. In the center of the concrete floor sat a single object, a life-sized antique porcelain doll seated in a small wooden rocking chair. It was dressed in a tattered, lace-trimmed Victorian gown, its painted face cracked and peeling. Its glass eyes, a startlingly bright blue, seemed to stare directly at me, and its painted-on smile looked less like joy and more like a pained grimace. I felt a profound sense of unease, a feeling of being an intruder in a sacred, terrible place. I stood there for a long moment, the silence of the hallway pressing in on me. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the rocking chair began to move. Back and forth, A low, soft creak filled the small space. My blood turned to ice. I didn't even think. I just slammed the heavy metal door shut, the sound booming through the facility like a gunshot. I fumbled with the lock, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in. I locked it and ran. I didn't stop until I was back in the relative safety of my office, my heart threatening to burst from my chest. I stared at the monitor for Unit 316's hallway. The door was closed, just as I'd left it. Everything was still, but I knew what I had seen. I quit the next day. I didn't give a reason, I just packed my things and left. A few weeks later, I drove by the facility. There was a large moving truck parked in front of Unit 316. A young couple was loading boxes into it. As I watched, the man carried out the small wooden rocking chair. Then the woman came out carrying the porcelain doll. As she walked past my car, she glanced in my direction. For a split second, I swear the doll's head turned and its cold blue glass eyes met mine. And its lips, those cracked, red-painted lips, widened into a broad, knowing smile. I don't know who that couple was or where they took that doll, but I know this. Some things aren't meant to be stored away, and some doors should never, ever be opened. My little sister Clara had an imaginary friend. Nothing unusual for a 7-year-old. She called him Mr. Giggles. He lived in the crawl space under our house. She'd spend hours sitting by the small access grate in the hallway closet, whispering and laughing with him. My parents thought it was cute. I thought it was creepy. The crawl space was a dark, spider-infested place that smelled of damp earth and decay. But Clara wasn't afraid. She'd say Mr. Giggles liked the dark. She said he was shy. Sometimes she would leave him gifts. A cookie, a shiny marble, one of my old toy soldiers. The next morning, the gifts would be gone. My parents assumed it was just mice. I wasn't so sure. One evening, I was home alone with Clara. My parents had gone to a neighbor's party. We were watching a movie when Clara suddenly got up and went to the closet. "Mr. Giggles is hungry," she announced. She came back a moment later with a plate of leftover spaghetti from dinner and slid it through the grate. I rolled my eyes but didn't say anything. A few minutes later, a strange noise came from the closet. A wet, slurping sound, followed by a low, contented chuckle. It wasn't Clara's laugh. It was deep, guttural, and it made the hairs on my arms stand up. "Clara, what was that?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. She just smiled. Mr. Giggles liked his dinner. Later that night, as I was tucking her into bed, she said something that chilled me to the bone. "Mr. Giggles wants to meet you," she said, her eyes wide and serious. "He says he has a gift for you. It's in the crawl space." I told her that was ridiculous and that Mr. Giggles wasn't real. She just shook her head. "He is real, and he's waiting." I couldn't sleep that night. Every creak of the old house sounded like something moving beneath the floorboards. Around 2 in the morning, I heard it. A soft, scratching sound coming from the hallway closet. Scratch, scratch, scratch. It was followed by a whisper, a dry, rasping sound that seemed to slither through the crack under my bedroom door. It was my name. "Jack." My heart stopped. It sounded like it was coming from the grate, from the crawl space. I lay there, rigid with fear, listening. The scratching stopped. Then I heard a voice clear as day right outside my door. It was my sister's voice. "Jake, are you awake?" "Mr. Giggles wants to play." I didn't answer. I held my breath, praying she would go away. The doorknob began to jiggle. Slowly, silently. I watched in horror as it turned. The door creaked open. In the sliver of moonlight from the hallway window, I saw her silhouette. But there was another shadow behind her. Something tall and thin and hunched over, its limbs too long, its shape all wrong. Clara stepped into the room and the thing behind her unfolded itself, rising to its full, terrifying height. I couldn't see its face, only a pair of pale, glowing eyes in the darkness of the doorway. "See?" Clara whispered, her voice filled with a chilling, childish glee. "I told you he was real." A long, spindly arm, ending in dirty, claw-like fingers, reached out and gently patted Clara on the head. Then, those glowing eyes fixed on me, and a low, guttural chuckle echoed in the silence of my room. That was the last thing I remember before I screamed. My parents came running. They found me hysterical, pointing at an empty doorway. Clara was fast asleep in her bed, looking angelic. They told me it was just a nightmare. But the next morning, when I went to the hallway closet, I saw something that proved it wasn't. Lying just inside the grate, placed neatly on the dusty floor of the crawl space, was one of my old toy soldiers, and its head had been cleanly twisted off. We bought the farmhouse for a steal. The realtor said it was an estate sale, that the previous owner, an old man named Silas, had passed away peacefully in his sleep. The place needed work, but it had good bones and sat on 50 acres of rolling hills. It was perfect. The only strange thing was the scarecrow in the cornfield out back. It was old, weathered, and crudely made. Its body was just a wooden cross draped in tattered burlap clothes, and its head was a stained pillowcase with 2 black buttons for eyes and a jagged stitched-on grin. It gave me the creeps, but my husband Tom thought it was charming, in a rustic sort of way. We were too busy with renovations to do anything about it. We left it standing sentinel over the dying corn stalks. Soon after we moved in, things started to go missing. Small things at first, a wrench from the toolbox, my favorite coffee mug, a set of keys. We blamed it on the chaos of unpacking, but then the disappearances became stranger. One of Tom's work boots vanished from the porch. A whole pie I had left cooling on the windowsill disappeared. We started getting unnerved. We were miles from our nearest neighbor. It couldn't be a person. Then, one morning, I looked out the kitchen window at the cornfield. The scarecrow was different. Its head was tilted at a new angle, and one of its stick-like arms was raised as if waving. I told Tom I was imagining things, that the wind must have shifted it. He agreed, but I saw the unease in his eyes. The next day, the scarecrow was in a completely different position, its body slumped to one side, its button eyes seeming to stare directly at our bedroom window. That night, we were awoken by a sound, a rhythmic dragging thump coming from outside. Thump, drag, thump, drag. Tom grabbed his shotgun from the closet. We crept to the window and peered out into the moonlit yard. My heart seized in my chest. The scarecrow was gone from its post. In its place was just an empty wooden cross. The thumping sound was getting closer. It was coming from the side of the house. We rushed to the living room window just in time to see it. The scarecrow. It was shambling across our lawn, dragging one of its legs behind it, the wooden stake at the bottom scraping a groove in the dirt. It moved with a lurching, unnatural gait, its burlap form animated by some unseen force. It was heading for our front porch. We didn't wait to see what it wanted. We ran to the back door, out into the cold night, and sprinted for the car. As we fumbled with the doors, I looked back at the house. The scarecrow had reached the front porch. It was slowly, deliberately climbing the steps. We screeched out of the driveway and sped down the long dirt road, not looking back. We drove straight to the nearest police station. They thought we were crazy, of course. 2 officers agreed to follow us back to the house, their faces a mixture of pity and annoyance. When we arrived, everything was quiet. The sun was beginning to rise. We walked them to the cornfield. The scarecrow was back on its post, exactly as we'd first found it. Its button eyes staring blankly, its stitched grin mocking us. The police found no evidence of a disturbance. They told us we probably had a waking dream, a shared hallucination brought on by the stress of the move. They left, shaking their heads. Tom and I stood there in the cold morning light, looking at the scarecrow. It looked so ordinary, so lifeless. But then I noticed something. Clutched in one of its straw-stuffed hands, barely visible amongst the burlap, was a single familiar object. It was my favorite coffee mug. We sold the farm a week later at a massive loss. We never told the new owners about the scarecrow. Sometimes I wonder if they've started noticing things going missing yet. And sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and I swear I can hear it, faint and distant. Thump, drag, thump, drag. My Uncle Robert was a long-haul trucker, a man who claimed to have seen every strange and forgotten corner of America. Most of his stories were tall tales, spun to entertain us kids around a campfire. But there was one story he only told once, late at night, his voice low and his eyes haunted. It was about a stretch of highway somewhere in the Nevada desert, a place he called the Static Mile. He said you'd know you were there because your radio would suddenly dissolve into a wall of white noise. Not just the music, but everything. The CB, the Weather Channel, even the emergency frequencies, all gone, replaced by a hissing, crackling static that seemed to crawl under your skin. The first time it happened to him, he was driving his rig through the dead of night. The world outside his cab was an ocean of black, the only light coming from his headlights cutting a lonely path through the darkness. Suddenly, the country music station he was listening to vanished into a loud shh. He fiddled with the dial, but every station was the same, just static. Annoyed, he was about to turn it off when he heard something within the noise, a voice. It was faint, distorted, like a bad phone connection, but it was there. It was a woman, and she was crying, a desperate, heartbroken sobbing that made the hair on his arms stand up. He slowed the truck, peering out into the empty desert, but there was nothing, just sagebrush and shadow. The sobbing continued for about a minute, then faded back into the static. A minute later, the radio clicked back on, and the country singer was right where he'd left off. My uncle was shaken, but he convinced himself it was just a stray signal, a radio anomaly. But a few months later, he was on that same stretch of road, and it happened again. The static roared to life, and this time, the voice was a man's. He wasn't crying. He was pleading. "Please," the voice begged over and over, distorted by the hiss. "Please, I didn't mean to. I'm sorry. Please." The voice was filled with such terror and regret that my uncle felt a cold dread wash over him. Just as before, after a minute, the voice was gone and the radio returned to normal. After that, he started to dread that part of his route. The static mile became a place of anxiety. He would turn his radio off preemptively, drive through in silence, his eyes scanning the darkness, his hands gripping the wheel. But he could still feel it, a sense of profound sadness and fear that hung in the air. The final time he drove the static mile, he forgot to turn the radio off. The static hit him like a physical blow. But this time, there were no voices. There was only one sound, buried deep within the white noise. It was the sound of a child's laughter. It wasn't happy laughter. It was cold and cruel and utterly devoid of joy. A chilling, mocking sound that echoed in the cab of his truck. He slammed on the brakes, the truck jackknifing with a screech of tortured metal. He sat there in the middle of the deserted highway, his heart pounding, listening to that terrible laughter. And then he saw them. At the very edge of his headlight beams, standing by the side of the road, were three figures: a man, a woman, and a small child. They were translucent, shimmering like a heat haze, their forms flickering in and out of existence. They weren't looking at him. They were looking at each other, their ghostly faces frozen in expressions of agony and terror. The child between them continued to laugh its cold, empty laugh. My uncle didn't wait to see more. He threw the truck into gear and stomped on the accelerator, not caring about the trailer. He drove for hours, far faster than he should have, the sound of that laughter chasing him through the night. He quit his job the next week. He sold his rig and never drove professionally again. He told me that some things you see on the road you can't unsee, and some things you hear, they stay with you forever, buried in the static. When my grandfather died, he left me his old cabin in the woods of northern Minnesota. It was a rustic, isolated place, the kind of spot where you could go for a week and not see another soul. I decided to spend a weekend there, to disconnect and sort through some of his old things. The cabin was just as I remembered it, smelling of pine and wood smoke, with dusty taxidermy animals staring down from the walls. In his bedroom, I found a box of old reel-to-reel audio tapes. My grandfather had been an amateur folklorist, obsessed with collecting local legends and ghost stories. I found an old tape player in a closet, threaded one of the spools, and pressed play. The tape hissed for a moment, and then my grandfather's familiar, gravelly voice filled the room. He was interviewing an old woman. She was telling a story about a thing the locals called the echo. She said it wasn't a ghost, not really. It was something that lived in the deepest parts of the forest, and it was a mimic. It learned. It started with simple sounds, she said. A bird call, the rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig. Then it would move on to more complex sounds. The chop of an axe, the rumble of a distant engine. But what it really loved, what it craved, was the sound of the human voice. She told a story of a logger who went missing in the woods back in the 30s. The search party looked for him for days. They found his axe, his lunch pail, but never him. But as they searched, they started to hear things. They'd hear their own names being called from deep within the trees, in the voice of one of their fellow searchers. My wife and I took a trip to Japan a few years ago. We wanted to get off the beaten, they'd shout back, but there would be no reply. Then they started hearing the missing logger's voice. They'd hear him whistling his favorite tune, just over the next ridge. They'd hear him laughing, just out of sight. They followed the sounds for days, going deeper and deeper into the woods, but they never found him. The old woman on the tape lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "The echo got him," she said. "It took his voice, and now it uses it. It uses it to draw people in. It offers you the sound of what you want to hear most." The tape ended. I sat there in the quiet cabin, a little spooked, but mostly fascinated. I put on another tape. More interviews, more stories. I listened for hours, losing track of time as the sun set outside. It was around midnight when I heard it. A faint tapping on the window pane. I froze. The cabin was miles from anywhere. It was probably just a branch. But then it came again. Tap, 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 tap. It was a rhythm. A deliberate knock. I crept to the window and peered out into the inky blackness. I couldn't see anything. I stood there listening, my heart starting to race. And then, I heard a voice. It was coming from right outside the window, from the darkness. "Honey, are you in there?" My blood ran cold. It was my mother's voice. The exact lilting tone, the same gentle cadence. But my mother was 500 miles away, in another state. It couldn't be her. "Honey, open the door," the voice pleaded, now sounding like it was coming from the front porch. "I'm cold. I got lost. Please, let me in." I was paralyzed with a mixture of terror and a strange, desperate hope. What if it was her? What if something had happened? I stood there trembling, my hand on the doorknob, and then I remembered the old woman's words on the tape. "It offers you the sound of what you want to hear most." The voice outside called again, this time with a note of panic. "Please, there's something out here. It's in the woods. Let me in." I backed away from the door, my mind screaming. It wasn't her. It was the echo. It had heard my grandfather's tapes. It had listened to me talking on the phone with my mom earlier that day. It was learning. It was using her voice to try and get inside. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the corner of the room, listening as the thing outside cycled through its repertoire. It used my father's voice, my best friend's voice, even my own voice, calling to myself from the darkness. It begged, it cried, it threatened. It was a symphony of terror, custom-made for me. I didn't leave the cabin until the sun was high in the sky, flooding the woods with light. I didn't pack anything. I just got in my car and drove. I left the tapes, the tape player, everything. I never went back. But sometimes when I'm on the phone with my mother, there's a moment, just a split second, where her voice sounds off. A slight echo, a faint distortion, and in that moment my heart stops. And I wonder, did the echo let me go? Or did it just follow me home? The summer job I landed in college was at the old city archive, a dusty, cavernous basement in the courthouse filled with centuries of forgotten documents. My task was to digitize old court records, a mind-numbing job of scanning brittle, yellowed paper. One day, my supervisor asked me to retrieve a file from the deep storage room, a section of the archive that was rarely entered. It was a small, windowless room, crammed floor to ceiling with old wooden filing cabinets. The air was thick with the smell of decay and old paper. The file I needed was in a cabinet at the very back. As I pulled open the heavy drawer, something fell out from behind it. It was a small, leather-bound book, no bigger than my hand. It was a diary. The date on the first page was 1888. It belonged to a girl named Elspeth. Her entries were mundane at first. Chores, church, a secret crush on a boy from the next farm over. But then the tone shifted. She started writing about the photographs. Her father was an amateur photographer, a new and exciting hobby at the time. He'd bought a new camera and was obsessed with taking family portraits. But when he developed the plates, there was always something wrong. In the photos, there was an extra person. A tall, blurry figure standing just behind the family, always in the shadows. They couldn't see it when the picture was being taken, but it was always there in the final image. A shadow man with long limbs and a featureless face. Elspeth was terrified. Her father became obsessed, taking photo after photo, trying to get a clear image of the shadow man, trying to understand what it was. Her diary entries described how he would lock himself in his dark room for days, emerging pale and frantic. The shadow man in the pictures was becoming clearer, sharper, more defined. It seemed to be getting closer to the family in each new photograph. In one, its long, blurry fingers were resting on Elspeth's shoulder. She wrote that she could sometimes feel a cold spot in the room, even on the warmest days. She could see a flicker of movement out of the corner of her eye. She was convinced the thing from the photographs was bleeding into their reality. Her father's obsession turned to madness. He began to believe the camera wasn't just capturing the entity, but that it was somehow a doorway for it. The final entry in the diary was short and written in a shaky, terrified hand. "Father is going to take one last picture tonight. He says he knows how to trap it. He's taking us all to the barn. He has the camera. God help us." I sat there, in the silence of the deep storage room, the little book cold in my hands. My curiosity was piqued. The file I had been sent to retrieve was a criminal record from 1888. I opened it. It was the case file for Elspeth's father. He had been arrested for the murder of his entire family. The official report said he had locked them in the barn and set it on fire. When the constable arrived, the barn was an inferno. The father was standing outside, staring into the flames, holding his camera. He was laughing. At the bottom of the file was a single evidence envelope. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a single glass photographic plate. It was cracked and heat damaged, but the image was still visible. It was a picture of the inside of the barn. Elspeth, her mother, her little brother, all huddled together, their faces masks of terror. And behind them, no longer blurry, no longer in the shadows, stood the thing. It was tall and skeletal, its limbs unnaturally long and thin. Its face was a smooth white oval, completely blank except for two dark, empty holes where its eyes should be. It wasn't a shadow anymore. It was solid. It was real. And it was staring directly at the camera. At me. I dropped the plate, and it shattered on the concrete floor. I didn't care. I scrambled out of that room, out of the archive, and I never went back. I left the diary, the file, everything. But I can't forget that image. And ever since that day, I've had a strange new fear. I hate having my picture taken. Because sometimes when I look at the photos later, I think I can see something, just out of focus, in the background. A tall, dark shape standing in the shadows. And I think it's getting closer. I work as a park ranger in one of the more remote sections of the Rocky Mountains. My station is a small cabin miles from any paved road, and my job is mostly trail maintenance and keeping an eye out for wildfires. I'm used to solitude. I'm used to the strange sounds the woods make at night. But last winter, I experienced something that no amount of training could prepare me for. A blizzard hit hard and fast, dumping 3 feet of snow in less than a day and cutting me off completely from the outside world. The power went out. The radio was dead. It was just me, a fireplace, and the howling wind. On the second night of being snowed in, I heard a knock at my door. It wasn't the frantic, desperate knock of a lost hiker. It was a slow, deliberate, patient knock. 3 heavy thuds that seemed to shake the whole cabin. I grabbed my flashlight and a heavy-duty mag light, my heart pounding. No one should be out here. No one could be out here. I shouted through the door, "Who's there?" Silence. The only answer was the shriek of the wind. I waited, my breath held tight in my chest. Then, the knocking came again, this time at the back door. Thud, thud, thud. Now I was terrified. Someone, or something, was circling the cabin. I moved through the small space, checking all the windows, but the snow was coming down so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet. I made sure every lock was bolted, every window secured. I stoked the fire until it was roaring and sat in the armchair facing the front door, the mag light clutched in my hand like a club. The knocking continued sporadically throughout the night, moving around the cabin, sometimes on a wall, sometimes on the roof, sometimes on the floorboards beneath my feet. It was toying with me, letting me know it could get in whenever it wanted. I didn't sleep a wink. Just as the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the windows, the knocking stopped. The silence that followed was somehow more menacing. I waited until the sun was fully up before I dared to look outside. I unbolted the door and stepped out into the pristine, untouched snow. There were no footprints, not a single track anywhere around the cabin. It was a perfect, unbroken blanket of white. My rational mind tried to find an explanation. The wind, falling branches heavy with snow, anything. But I knew what I had heard. Later that day, as I was clearing a path to the woodshed, I found it. A single, massive footprint in the snow near the tree line. It was at least 2 feet long, vaguely humanoid, but the toes were too long, and it had what looked like a large, sharp claw mark at the heel. It was the only track. It was as if something had taken a single giant step out of the woods and then vanished. I didn't see anything else for the rest of the winter, but I was never truly alone in that cabin again. I could feel it, watching me from the trees, and on quiet, cold nights, I would sometimes hear a sound carried on the wind, a single, heavy thud echoing from deep within the forest, like something knocking on a tree, patiently waiting for me to come out and play. Path. So we rented a car and drove into the countryside. We found a traditional inn, a ryokan, nestled in a valley by a river. It was beautiful, serene, and, as we would soon discover, deeply unsettling. The innkeeper was an ancient woman with a kind smile and eyes that seemed to hold a profound sadness. She showed us to our room, a simple tatami mat room with paper screen walls. As she was leaving, she paused at the door and said, in broken English, "Do not be alarmed by the laughing." We asked her what she meant, but she just smiled, bowed, and slid the door shut, leaving us in confused silence. We soon found out what she meant. As night fell, a strange sound began to drift through the thin walls of the inn. It was the sound of children laughing, giggling, shrieks of delight, the kind of joyful noise you'd hear from a playground. Except it was close to midnight, and we were in a remote inn with no other guests. The laughter seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It echoed down the long, dark hallways. It seemed to whisper from just outside our paper screen window. It was constant, a cheerful, innocent sound that, in the dead of night, became utterly terrifying. We tried to ignore it, burying our heads under the thick futon blankets, but the sound seeped through, impossible to block out. Sleep was impossible. At one point, I had to use the restroom, which was down the hall. I slid open our door and peered out into the corridor. It was lit by a single dim lantern at the far end. The hallway was empty, but the laughter was louder out here, echoing off the dark wood. It felt like the children were just around the corner, just out of sight. As I walked, I saw something that made me freeze. On the paper screen wall of the room next to ours, a small handprint appeared. A child's handprint, pressed against the paper from the inside, silhouetted by the light within. Then another appeared, and another. Small, dark handprints, appearing and disappearing all along the walls of the hallway, keeping pace with me as I walked. They were playing. I turned and ran back to our room, my heart in my throat. I didn't use the restroom. I didn't leave the room again until morning. The laughter finally faded with the first light of dawn. When we came down for breakfast, the inn was silent. The old woman served us rice and fish, her face as serene as ever. We asked her about the noises, about the children. Her smile faltered for a moment, and the sadness in her eyes deepened. "They are the Zashiki Warashi," she said softly. "The guest children. They have lived in this inn for a very long time. They like to play with new visitors." She explained that they were spirits, household ghosts. They were considered good luck, and their laughter meant the inn would prosper. But then she looked at me, her gaze piercing, and added, "But you must never make them angry. They are children, and children can be cruel when they are not happy." We checked out immediately after breakfast. As we were loading our bags into the car, I looked up at the inn. In the window of our room, I saw them. Two small figures, a boy and a girl, their faces pale and indistinct. They weren't laughing now. They were just standing there watching us leave. And as we drove away, the little boy slowly raised his hand and waved goodbye. The antique shop was my weakness. I could spend hours sifting through other people's forgotten lives. One Saturday, I found a beautiful ornate silver mirror in a dusty corner of the shop. The frame was decorated with intricate carvings of vines and strange, nocturnal flowers. The shop owner, a wiry old man with spectacles perched on his nose, gave me an odd look when I brought it to the counter. "Be careful with that one," he rasped. "It shows you more than just your reflection." I laughed it off as a salesman's pitch and took the mirror home. I hung it in my hallway opposite the front door. It looked stunning. For the first few days, it was just a mirror. But then I started noticing things. Little inconsistencies. I'd walk past it, and out of the corner of my eye, I'd see my reflection. But it would be a split second behind my actual movement. I'd turn my head, and for a heartbeat, my reflection would still be looking straight ahead. I told myself it was a trick of the light, a flaw in the old glass. Then, the changes became more pronounced. I'd glance at the mirror and see things in the reflection of the room behind me that weren't there. A book on the table would be closed in reality, but open in the mirror. A jacket I'd left on a chair would be gone from the reflection. It was as if the mirror was showing me a slightly different version of my own home, a version where someone was moving my things. The real terror started when my reflection itself began to change. I'd look into the mirror, and the reflection staring back at me would have a different expression. I'd be smiling, but my reflection would have a look of profound sadness. I'd look tired, but my reflection's eyes would be wide with a frantic, terrified energy. It was subtle, but it was there. It was my face, but it wasn't my emotion. One night I couldn't sleep. I went to the kitchen to get a glass of water. As I walked down the hallway, I glanced at the mirror, and my heart stopped. In the dark glass, I saw my reflection. It was standing in the middle of the hallway, just as I was, but it wasn't alone. Standing behind it, its hands on my reflection's shoulders, was a tall, shadowy figure. I couldn't make out any features, just a dark, man-shaped void. I whipped. Around, my back pressed against the wall, staring into the empty hallway. There was nothing there. I looked back at the mirror. The shadow figure was still there, standing behind my reflection. And then, my reflection did something that broke me. It looked at me, its eyes wide with terror, and it slowly, almost imperceptibly, shook its head, a silent, desperate no. It was a warning. The shadow thing, the real thing, was in the hallway with me. I just couldn't see it. I screamed and ran into my bedroom, slamming and locking the door. I didn't come out until morning. The next day, I took the mirror down. I didn't sell it. I didn't want to pass this curse on to anyone else. I wrapped it in heavy blankets, drove it to a landfill, and threw it into a dumpster, watching as it was buried under a pile of refuse. I thought that would be the end of it, but I was wrong. The mirror is gone, but the feeling of being watched has never left. And sometimes when I catch my reflection in a dark window or a polished surface, I see it, just for a second. The reflection looking back at me is not my own. Its eyes are filled with a terror I can't comprehend, and it's begging me for help. It's trapped in there in the mirror world with that thing. And I'm out here, and I'm starting to wonder, if my reflection is in there, then what exactly is looking out of my eyes? My great-grandfather was a lighthouse keeper on a small windswept island off the coast of Maine. In his later years, he was a man of few words, his eyes always seeming to gaze at a distant, troubled horizon. He left behind a single salt-stained logbook, and in it, he detailed the events of the winter of 1923, the winter the fog never left. The fog, he wrote, rolled in one November afternoon and simply stayed. It was a thick, unnatural fog, a roiling wall of gray that swallowed the sky and the sea. It muffled all sound, creating a world of profound, oppressive silence, broken only by the mournful, rhythmic groan of the foghorn. For weeks, he was trapped in a world of gray. He couldn't see the mainland. He couldn't see the stars. His only company was the great, sweeping beam of the lighthouse, cutting its futile path through the endless mist. Then he started to see things in the fog. Shapes. Tall, spindly figures moving slowly at the edge of the shore, just beyond the reach of the light. They were indistinct, like smudges of charcoal against a gray canvas. But they were there. They never came closer. They just walked the perimeter of the island, their silent, ceaseless patrol a constant, unnerving presence. He tried to rationalize it. Tricks of the light. Hallucinations brought on by isolation and the disorienting, featureless world of the fog. But then came the voices. They were whispers, carried on the damp air, seeming to come from the fog itself. At first, they were just sounds, murmurs without words. But over time, they grew clearer. They began to speak his name. "Thomas," they would whisper from just outside his window. "Thomas, let us in." The voices were seductive, promising an end to his loneliness. They spoke of a world beyond the fog, a quiet, peaceful place. He wrote in his logbook of the terrible temptation to open the door, to walk out into the gray and join them. What kept him sane, what kept him locked inside, was the light. The great turning lamp was his anchor in a world that had lost its bearings. But one night, the mechanism that turned the light jammed. The powerful beam stopped its sweeping arc and pointed out at a single, fixed point in the fog. My great-grandfather, a man who knew every gear and spring of that lighthouse, worked frantically to fix it, his hands slick with grease and sweat. As he worked, the whispers from the fog grew louder, more insistent. They were right outside the lantern room now, their voices swirling around the glass. "The light is gone, Thomas. You are in the dark with us now." He finally managed to fix the mechanism, and the great light began to turn once more. As the beam swung around, it illuminated the catwalk outside the lantern room, and for a single terrifying second, he saw them. They were not smudges. They were tall, gaunt creatures, their skin the pale gray of the fog itself. They had no eyes, no features on their smooth, blank faces. Their long, thin limbs were wrapped around the railing of the catwalk, their bodies pressed against the glass. The light swept past them, and they were gone, swallowed by the darkness. But in that 1 second, he had seen them, and he knew they were real. The fog finally lifted on a clear, cold morning in late January. My great-grandfather was rescued a few days later by a supply ship, his hair having turned completely white. He never set foot in a lighthouse again. He finished his logbook with a single chilling entry. "The fog will return," he wrote, "and they will come with it. They are not spirits of the dead. They are something else, something older. And all they want is for the light to go out. I'm a geologist, and I spend a lot of my time in remote, inhospitable places. A few years ago, I was part of a team surveying a newly discovered cave system deep in the Appalachian Mountains. It was an incredible find, a network of tunnels and caverns that had been sealed off from the world for millennia. We were the first human beings to ever set foot inside. The air was cold and still, and the only sound was the drip of water and the crunch of our boots on the calcite floor. We rappelled down into the main cavern, a space so vast our headlamps couldn't find the far wall. It was breathtaking. We spent the first day setting up our equipment and taking initial readings. It was on the second day that we found the drawings. On a smooth, high wall, far from the entrance, were a series of pictographs painted in red ochre. They were unlike any prehistoric art I had ever seen. They depicted tall, thin, human-like figures, but their limbs were too long, their heads too large, and they weren't hunting mammoths or bison. They were gathered in a circle, their long arms raised towards the ceiling of the cave. And in the center of the circle there was a drawing of a shape, a complex geometric symbol that seemed to pulse with a strange energy, even in its simple painted form. We were ecstatic. This was a discovery that would rewrite the history books. But as we documented the art, a sense of unease began to settle over the team. The cave, which had at first felt ancient and peaceful, now felt watchful. We started hearing things, faint whispers that seemed to come from the rock itself. The sound of bare feet shuffling on stone just at the edge of our hearing. We told ourselves it was the acoustics of the cave, our minds playing tricks on us in the absolute dark and silence. Then our equipment started to fail. Batteries would drain in minutes. Our radios would emit bursts of static. Our compasses spun uselessly. We were cut off. It was my colleague, Dr. Aris Thorne, a man I'd always known to be the pinnacle of scientific rationality, who began to unravel first. He became obsessed with the pictographs, specifically the strange symbol in the center. He would spend hours just staring at it, muttering to himself. He claimed he could hear it. A song, he said, a vibration coming from the rock. One night, I woke up to find Aris gone from his sleeping bag. His headlamp was off. I grabbed mine and did a sweep of the cavern. I found him standing in front of the wall of pictographs, his back to me. He was humming, a low, dissonant, tuneless sound that made my skin crawl. "Aris," I said, "what are you doing?" He didn't turn around. "They're waking up," he whispered, his voice sounding hollow and strange in the vast space. "They hear the song. We woke them up when we came in." Suddenly, my headlamp flickered and went out. The cavern was plunged into absolute terrifying darkness. I fumbled for my backup, my hands shaking. And in that moment of pure blackness, I heard it too. It wasn't a song. It was a sound. The sound of rock grating on rock. 1,000 tiny movements, all around us, in the walls, in the ceiling, in the floor. The sound of something impossibly ancient, stirring from a long, long sleep. I finally got my backup light on. I pointed the beam at Aris. He was gone. The wall of pictographs was bare. Aris, the drawings, everything had vanished. The rock was smooth and untouched, as if it had never been disturbed. I was alone. I don't remember much about getting out of the cave. It was a blind panic, a scramble up ropes in the dark, fueled by pure adrenaline. When I finally emerged into the sunlight, I was babbling, incoherent. The rest of the team thought I'd lost my mind, that Aris had simply fallen into an unexplored chasm. They searched for him for weeks but found nothing. There was no evidence of the pictographs, no sign of what we had discovered. My career was ruined. I was dismissed as a fraud who had cracked under pressure. But I know what I saw, and I know what I heard. Sometimes, in the dead of night, when the house is silent, I can still hear it, that low humming vibration. And I know that somewhere, deep beneath the earth, in a darkness we can't comprehend, they are awake, and they are singing. When I was a kid, my family would spend a week every summer at a rented lake house in rural Wisconsin. It was a classic, rustic cabin, all peeling paint and creaky floorboards. The best part was the lake itself, a deep, dark body of water surrounded by dense pine forest. One summer, when I was about 12, a new family rented the cabin next to ours. They had a daughter my age named Lily. She was strange, quiet, with pale skin and large, dark eyes that always seemed to be looking at something just past your shoulder. She told me the lake had a secret. She said if you swam out to the very center, to the deepest part, and you were very quiet, you could hear them. The sunken folk, she called them. She said they were the people who had drowned in the lake over the years. They didn't die, not really. They just changed. They lived at the bottom, in the cold and the dark. I thought she was just trying to scare me. But she was so serious, so convinced, that it was hard to completely dismiss. One afternoon, she dared me to swim out to the middle with her. I was a strong swimmer, but the thought of that deep black water gave me a primal fear. Still, I couldn't back down from a dare. We swam out together, the shore receding behind us, the water growing colder as it got deeper. When we reached the spot where the water was a dark, inky blue, she told me to stop. "Now just float," she whispered, "and listen." I treaded water, my ears just below the surface. At first, all I heard was the muffled sound of my own heartbeat. But then, I heard something else. A faint, melodic humming, coming from deep below. It wasn't a song with words, just a chorus of low, mournful tones that seemed to vibrate through the water and into my bones. It was beautiful and deeply, deeply sad. I pulled my head out of the water, gasping. "Did you hear it?" Lily asked, her face calm. I nodded, too spooked to speak. We swam back to shore in silence. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing that humming in my head. I went to my window, which overlooked the lake. The moon was full, casting a silver path across the black water, and then I saw her. Lily. She was standing on the end of their dock staring out at the lake. But she wasn't alone. Standing on the surface of the water, at the end of the moonlit path, were figures. Tall, slender silhouettes, their bodies seeming to be made of water and moonlight. They were beckoning to her, their long arms outstretched. Lily took a step off the dock. She didn't fall. She walked onto the surface of the lake, onto that silver path, and began to walk towards them. I wanted to scream, to call out, but my voice was caught in my throat. I just watched as she walked to the center of the lake, met the shimmering figures, and then together, they all slowly, gracefully sank beneath the surface. The water rippled for a moment, and then was still. I ran to wake my parents. I told them what I saw. They, of course, didn't believe me. They went next door. The cabin was empty. The family had gone. The police were called. They searched the lake for days. They found nothing. The official story was that the family had simply cut their vacation short and left in the middle of the night. But I know what happened. I never went back to that lake house. But the memory of that night has never left me. Sometimes when I'm near water, a deep river, or the ocean at night, I close my eyes. And if I listen, really listen, I can still hear it. That sad, beautiful humming, rising from the deep. And I know the sunken folk are still there. And I think they're still waiting. My first real job out of college was as a junior archivist at a small private university library. The head archivist, a formidable woman named Ms. Albright, gave me a project she called the Whispering Collection. It was a series of boxes containing the personal effects of a 19th century poet named Alistair Finch, a man who had gone mad and died in an asylum. The collection was said to be cursed. Previous archivists had complained of hearing whispers while working with it, of feeling watched, of having vivid, terrifying nightmares. Ms. Albright, a staunch skeptic, called it nonsense and told me to get to work. Alistair's poetry was dark, filled with imagery of shadows, echoes, and unseen things that lived in the corners of rooms. His letters were even more disturbing. He wrote to a friend about a phenomenon he called the resonance. He believed that strong emotions, particularly fear and despair, could leave an imprint on a place, an echo that could be heard by those who were receptive. He believed the asylum he was in was a symphony of such echoes. The most unsettling item in the collection was a small, tarnished silver locket. It was empty, but when I held it, I felt a profound, bone-deep cold, and I could have sworn I heard a faint, sorrowful whisper in my ear. I started working late, wanting to prove Ms. Albright wrong, wanting to find a rational explanation. The archive was in the library's sub-basement, a place that was unnervingly silent at night. As I sat at my desk, surrounded by Alistair's mad scribblings, I started to hear it. A faint whispering, just at the edge of hearing. It sounded like dozens of voices, all murmuring at once, their words indistinct. I told myself it was the ventilation system, the old building settling. But the whispering seemed to have an intelligence to it. It would get louder when I picked up one of Alistair's letters and fade when I put it down. One night I was reading a particularly chilling poem about a man who sees a second shadow attached to his own. a darker, more predatory version of himself. As I read the last line, the lights in the archive flickered and went out. I was plunged into absolute darkness. The emergency lights didn't come on. I sat frozen in my chair, my heart hammering. The whispering was no longer at the edge of my hearing. It was all around me, in the room with me, dozens of hushed, frantic voices speaking over one another. I could feel cold spots moving through the room, brushing against my skin. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking too much to turn on the flashlight. And then, one voice rose above the others, clear and terrifyingly close. It was a man's voice, filled with a poetic, despairing madness. "They see you," it whispered directly into my ear. "The echoes, they see your fear, and they are hungry." I screamed and bolted from my chair, knocking it over. I ran blindly through the darkness, crashing into shelves, the sound of fluttering paper and whispering voices chasing me. I finally found the door, fumbled with the handle, and burst out. Into the lit hallway of the sub-basement, collapsing on the floor, gasping for breath. The lights in the archive flickered back on. Everything was silent. I quit the next day. I told Ms. Albright the collection was too much for me. She just gave me a long, knowing look and nodded. I left the university and never worked in a library again. But I didn't escape Alistair Finch. I didn't escape the resonance. Sometimes, when I am in a place where great sadness has occurred, a hospital, a cemetery, an old abandoned house, I can hear them, the whispers, the echoes of old pain. And sometimes, very late at night when I am alone in the dark, I hear his voice, as clear as if he were standing right next to me. "They see you," he whispers, "and they are still hungry." I used to be a 911 dispatcher. You hear a lot of things in that job, a lot of tragedy, a lot of panic. Most calls, even the strange ones, have an explanation. But there was one call, one that came in on a dead night shift that I've never been able to explain, and I've never been able to forget. The call came in around 3:33 a.m. There was no voice on the other end, just a strange, rhythmic clicking sound and what sounded like a child humming a nursery rhyme. But all the notes were wrong, discordant, and unsettling. The line was registered to a farmhouse about 20 miles out of town, a place owned by an elderly couple, the Hendersons. I tried to speak to whoever was on the line. 911, what's your emergency? I said over and over. But there was no response. Just the clicking and the horribly off-key humming. I dispatched a patrol car. The officer, a veteran cop named Miller, knew the Hendersons. Good people, he said, kept to themselves. As Miller was en route, the sound on the line changed. The humming stopped, replaced by a wet, tearing sound and a low, guttural growl. My blood ran cold. It sounded like an animal, a very large animal. I stayed on the line, listening, my stomach in knots. I could hear something being dragged across what sounded like a wooden floor. Then, a new sound. A voice. It was a man's voice, but it was distorted, as if it was being played through a broken speaker. It spoke only one word, repeating it like a mantra. Hungry, hungry, hungry. Miller arrived at the farmhouse about 15 minutes later. He came over the radio, his voice tense. Dispatch, I'm on scene. All the lights are on in the house, but there's no answer at the door. I'm going to make entry. The line from the house was still open. I could hear Miller's voice, faintly, through the phone as he announced his presence and entered the house. Then I heard him gasp. Dispatch, my God. I heard him retching, and then he spoke into his radio. His voice choked. Get back up out here. Get the coroner, now. The scene he described was a bloodbath. The Hendersons were both dead, but it wasn't a normal homicide. They had been butchered, torn apart. The furniture was overturned, the walls splattered with blood. But there was no sign of a forced entry. All the doors and windows were locked from the inside. And there was something else. Scrawled on the wall, in what the lab later confirmed was the victim's own blood, was that same single word: hungry. Miller was clearing the house room by room, his gun drawn. The phone line was still open. I was listening to the dead air, the occasional sound of Miller's footsteps, and then I heard it again, the clicking sound. It wasn't coming from Miller's end. It was coming from the phone line, from inside the house. It was faint, but it was getting closer. "Miller," I said into my headset, my voice trembling. "Miller, do you hear that?" "Hear what?" he replied, his voice a tense whisper over the radio. The clicking was louder now. It was in the same room as the phone. "It's in the house with you," I said, my voice rising in panic. "Whatever did this, it's still there." There was a moment of silence, and then I heard it through the open phone line. A floorboard creaked right behind where Miller must have been standing. The distorted, gravelly voice whispered directly into the phone's receiver. "Hungry." I heard a single gunshot. Then the line went dead. The backup team found Officer Miller in the kitchen. He was dead. His own service weapon had been used. The official report called it a murder-suicide. They said Miller must have snapped at the horrific scene, killed the Hendersons, and then taken his own life. They said I was overwrought, that I had imagined the sounds on the phone line. But I know what I heard. And I have the recording of that call locked away in a safe. I listen to it sometimes in the dead of night. I listen to the clicking, the humming, and that terrible, inhuman voice. Because I need to remember. I need to remember that there are things in this world that are old and dark, and always, always hungry. If you've made it this far, you understand that the world is thinner than you think. The shadows are deeper, and not all of them are empty. These stories, these moments of terror and inexplicable dread, are not just campfire tales. They are warnings. They are glimpses through the cracks in reality. So the next time you hear a strange noise in your empty house, or see a figure in your peripheral vision, don't be so quick to dismiss it. Listen closer. Look harder. You might not like what you find. If you have your own glimpse to share, a story that keeps you awake at night, leave it in the comments below. Misery loves company after all. And if you want to hear more from the thin places, be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell. You wouldn't want to miss a thing. Trust me,